Hi guys, welcome back. We're going to talk a little bit today about complementary colours and the importance of underpainting, not underpants. You're looking at a scene in real life and or a reference drawing, and you're just about to start your painting and you have to choose some colours. So it's quite instinctive and natural to look at the trees and go, well, they're green, and to look at the sky and go, that's blue, and then sort of paint by numbers almost, like choose the sky as a zone and just paint that and paint that. But often I think what you do when you approach things in that literal sense is you miss some of the benefits of watercolour as a media. Like, the thing that I love the most about watercolour is the chaos and the way things move around and just get sort of mixed up, and that's the sort of joy in it, really. So what I want to show you today is a technique called underpainting. And when you choose the colours that you use for underpainting, you don't actually have to be that literal. You can choose some harmonious colours, complementary colours, or you can choose something really wacky. But I'm going to show you a few examples first of all, and then we're going to do a painting demo, a full painting demo. That's quite a complicated scene. It's a very big panorama. It could go disastrously wrong. I don't really know, but we're going to have a play with that, and there's going to be a little bit of underpainting involved with that as well. And I might also talk a little bit about some values and the usual bobbins. So yeah, should we crack on? Okay, so I've drawn up 4 really simple scenes. It's a sort of country churchyard scene, kind of out in my head really. And I just want to show you a few things about complementary colours. Now, as you can see here on the screen, I'm going to put a colour wheel. Now a colour wheel and how to use a colour wheel, that's going to be another tutorial, because there's an awful lot to go out there in terms of how you can make a colour wheel with the paints you have, or how to construct that. But basically, for the sake of this one, to start with, if you just put into Google or search engine of your choice, colour wheel, you'll see how this colour wheel appears. Now so with all that, we can use the colour wheel to figure out what are complementary colours. Now those colours are the opposite side of the colour wheel. So if you imagine the colour wheel was a clock, it's like 3 or 9 or 12 or 6, if that makes sense. So those contrasting colours, for example, would be red or green. You also have blue and orange, and then there's sort of purple, yellow, stroke green or line green. And you can really use those to your advantage when it comes to creating quite impactful paintings. So let's just have a look at some examples of that in real life, if you know what I mean. So for my first picture here, I'm going to just do a really simple example of the kind of stuff that we see, you know. So we look at the sky, quite often for the sky, I'm going to bring my paint in here so you can see my palette. I might use a cobalt blue, for example. That's a nice sort of general sky colour. I'm using a small mop brush here. I love using mop brushes because they contain an awful lot of water, and the most important thing in watercolour is always the water. So there you go, I'm not being too precious. And then what else are you going to see in that scene? Now, if you're looking at that during the day and it's quite a normal scene, you're going to have some greens. So I'm going to choose a little bit of sap green. I'm just going to splat that in quickly. I'm not bothered about letting it dry. I'm just going to put that straight in. And then I'm going to choose a little bit of undersea green for the grass at the front. It's a little bit darker, maybe a bit of sap green too. Here you go. So really, if you wanted a clear line here, definition between the sky and the ground and all those colours we've put in, you really want to let that dry before you start putting in the colour of the stonework on the church. But we're not going to do that because we're just going to crack on. So I'm going to take a little bit of this natural sienna, and that's a sort of, I would say, a very earth tone yellow, if you know what I mean. And I'm going to put that in here. Now this is absolutely fine. It's like I say, this is just an example of how it would look naturally. And then obviously you can put a grain for the church roof. So I'll just choose a little bit of Van Dyke brown, and I'm going to mix that with a little bit of blue, just an India thorn blue there, and then just work that in. So there you go. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's a nice little sketch. It's got some bright colours. It's fine. And that's really how a lot of people start when they start with watercolours. And there's nothing wrong with starting with trying to replicate what you see, because that's often the most natural way of sort of starting in the art journey, isn't it? You know, we look at form, we look at shape, and we go, oh, that's taller there, or that colour's brighter than that colour. And then we start to understand a little bit more about values and tones and things like that. We'll leave that there. Okay, so the next one I want to have a look at is what I would consider an underpainting. Now, an underpainting is when you do an initial very loose wash and then you go back and add layers on top of it. So with this first picture you saw here, you would go back and you would add in some darker greens and some darker shadows and things on the stonework. But you would do that independently, if you know what I mean, in each area. Whereas when you create a picture with an underpainting, you tend to think of the picture more as a whole from the beginning. So what you're doing is you're starting by painting the whole picture in one, really, or with a couple of different colours. And then you concentrate down into different areas. So let's see how that looks. So really, you could use the same colours we used before. You could use the blue and the natural sienna, which is your yellow, because they're slightly quite complementary. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to push it a little bit more, and we're going to go with a blue and an orange. So let's have a look at those together. So I'm going to use French ultramarine blue, and let's just put a little sample of that on here. And as you can see, that's quite a dark blue. I might put a tiny bit of cobalt in there, line up a tiny bit. Hopefully you can see that there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of this transparent red oxide. Is that? Oh no, that's Pyrrole orange, which is a very, very poppy orange. I'm going to use it quite dilute. So there you go. And those colours are going to be pretty much opposite on the colour wheel, the orange and the blue. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do like a complementary wash. And this is going to be the underpainting. So this is going to sit below everything else. So we're going to start off with some of the blue quite strong at the top, and then we're going to bring it down into a softer gradient as we come down. So take a little bit of French ultramarine, a little bit of that cobalt blue, and we're going to put that in at the top, and then just getting it a bit wetter as we come down. And then start with a little bit of that orange in this corner. So you've got this gap in the middle here. So one of the easiest things I find is use a bit of fresh water and just fill that gap up. And just let the paint do its thing there. So you can see what I've created. I might actually go a bit stronger in here. Is a bit of a variation from top to bottom in a contrasting colour. Now we're going to go back in and we're going to do a little bit more work on that in a bit, but hopefully you can see how that is technically an underpainting, because it's going to sit below everything else, and it's using complementary colours to create that wash. Now, while we're going to let that do its thing, I want to move over to this one and have a look at complementary colours in shadows. Now, I think it's a really fun technique. This is a really interesting one, but to do this, what I'm going to have to do is just paint in an area here. So I'm just going to use again some of this natural sienna, which is very much like a yellow ochre colour, in here, just on this church. I'm just going to let that dry for a couple of minutes, and then we'll come back and add some shadows in there. And you can see how you can use shadows as complementary colours. It's a really fun one, that. So then we'll come back and visit these because I'm just sort of letting these dry as I go. But for the last one, I want to talk about complementary colours sort of in the abstract, really. Now, personally, I quite like sometimes some abstract colour schemes, you know, things that are a little bit left of centre, if you know what I mean. And you can do some really fun things with abstract colour. So if you were to take two colours that are very much opposite on the colour wheel, and this is chromium turquoise, which is Daniel Smith colour. I think this is the light version. Again, we can do this as a sort of underpainting. And then some quinacridone rose, which is a really bright poppy. It's sort of a purple colour. Now these again are complementary. They're on the opposite side of the colour wheel. And there's other examples you can use of this. You can use a purple. Let's just mix that up here, and you can see I'm going to add a bit more of that quinacridone rose into there to make a purple. That's going to sit really well with a really, really bright yellow. And again, you know, these are really fun to use together. And you can see where those meet, they sort of vibrate with each other. So when it comes to urban sketching, you know, you can use some quite bright colours, you can use some quite contrasting colours, you can go a bit wacky with it, nothing wrong with that. Okay, so let's have a look back at this complementary wash that I did here. So what would the next stages of this one be? Well, what you're really looking for is building it up in layers. Now, obviously, I'm not going to do a whole painting here, but the next stage, I would say, is going in and adding in some darker tones for the trees behind, and then really adding some adding in some more stonework sort of tones on the church itself. So we can have a little look at that and how that's going to work. So I'm going to put in a little bit of, you know, I'm going to mix up a tiny bit of green with some cobalt, and then some Hansa yellow medium. Maybe darken it up a little bit, and then I can just add in there some of those. And then I'm going to go and add in the same thing, but with some blue, French ultramarine blue, and I'm going to make that a bit more of a richer mix. And then that could be a sort of darker area here. And then we're going to have a slightly darker area across there for the grass. And then when it really comes to doing the church, again, you can go back to that natural sienna. You can, whereas I just added it in there, you can sort of add that over the top in some of the lighter areas. But in the darker areas, again, use a little bit of that, you know, French ultramarine. Create some shadows. So you're really going in with more sort of blue here. And this is kind of creating what is like an early evening feel with this one, really. But it's just a lot more interesting. Now, I'm not going to continue that any further, but hopefully that will give you a sort of sense of that moving colours around and how to create a bit more luminosity. And you can go even further if you wanted to add in a little bit more colour here, like a quinacridone gold or a yellow. You know, as if the sun was just catching the top of this church here. So you get the impression. Hopefully you get the impression. So going back to this one here with the complementary shadows. So this orange, again, the complementary colour would be a blue, really. So using the complementary colour for shadows here, I'm going to just take a little bit of French ultramarine blue, which is one of my favourite blues. I love it. And I'm just going to take add some shadow colours on that side, and then there would be some here. And then I'm going to add some there. Now, obviously, I'm just sort of dotting these in. It's not dried, so there you go. So you can see how that works together to create shadow areas. And then if we go back to this one here, which is the abstract one, I mean, you could do whatever you want with this, but I tend to think if you're going very, very wacky with colours, sometimes it's quite nice to leave some areas white. So what you're doing is using those colours as pops, but you're not going to go in and add crazy yellow or crazy pink or whatever, because it just gets too much. So you could leave those areas as white rather than painted. But what I occasionally like to do for this is I'll mix up a little bit of grey, which I use Van Dyke Brown, and French Ultramarine is a nice one because that sort of granulates ever so slightly. Okay, so I'll get that a sort of tea texture, and then I'll go in and add some shadows to the church, but leaving those colours quite abstract. I quite like that, so let's go and do that. I'm not bothered about that bit there. Maybe some shadow down here. Okay, so there you go. That's some 4 really sort of simple examples of how you can use complementary color. We have a kind of, just looking at, we have a simple kind of natural version there that would be the way that most people would, you know, paint with watercolor. We have a slightly more interesting one here. I'm now going a bit crazy with the yellow in this one, but that's a kind of complementary colors in a wash, which is effectively like an underpainting. And underpainting is increasingly more and more the way that I paint, I'll be honest. I find it more interesting and the results are so much more dynamic. We have complementary colors here when you're using shadows. Now, this technique is very, very well recognized, but I think it's always worth trying and doing some simple swatches like this. And then we're back to the more abstract idea of using complementary colors for quite vivid, like urban sketching, where you're just dropping in color pops and making it go a bit mad. There you go. So there's 3 samples of how you can use complementary colors in for abstract stuff that really pops, for color pops. And actually that includes often if you're doing a big scene that's quite subtle. If you look at the scene overall and if it's quite blue and you want to put a couple of color highlights in, like if it's an evening scene on the street and you want to put a couple of really complementary dots in there, a couple of tail lights on the car can really make that pop and look really cool. Or if it's a sort of evening scene and you have a lot of orange in there, a couple of pops of blue can really set that off. So it's always worth thinking of complementary colors, particularly towards the end of a painting, when you want to put little details in that add a little bit of interest and steer the eye to various bits of the drawing. So there you go. So I hope you kind of get the basics of that. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a longer form painting where I can bring in some of those techniques and we can talk a little bit more about color theory as we go. There's going to be fast forwarded here for YouTube people, and then for my patrons you'll be able to see the full painting with commentary and stuff as we go. So later in the year I'm going to be launching a couple of really interesting new series, and it's going to be drawing and painting fundamentals. So we're going to start from scratch and then go forward, so remember to check those out. So let's crack on with the big painting. Right, so we'll start in this top corner. You can see there's the dark grey there for the leaves, but I've dropped in some of the quinacridone browse, which is, you know, on blue, which I've used throughout really. And then really you can see how the Parliament's built up, and I've added in some of those lights to create some reflections. But as you can see, it's very sketchy. I should really put some hands on the clock. I think that I could actually lift out some of that yellow to try and make it a little bit lighter. I might do that now. I don't know where my water's gone. That looks a bit more fluorescent, doesn't it? Somehow. Yeah. Okay, so lifting that out's helped. We've got some of these clouds up here with some hard edges and soft edges, which are really nice. Some blue and purple in there. The lamp's really fun. We've got some more reflected areas there. That bridge is a little bit abstractly put in. Yeah, there's a lot of purple, a lot of blue in there. There's no grey. There's a lot of mixtures and layers. But yeah, it's worked out quite well. I quite like it. Well, that one got a bit out of control. So I hope you enjoyed that. Hopefully you can see from that demonstration how using complementary colours in the underpainting can be really effective, and also how you can use it to create some highlights. Say, so the purple is really popping with that yellow that I've used in the lamp, and some of the little highlights that I've put in terms of like lights and reflections in the water and things like that. This is kind of where I really like art, is when it's kind of like loose, a little bit expressive, but still kind of communicating a feeling and colours and a time of day and things like that. So if you want to help out the channel and you enjoyed this video, please give us a like, drop a comment, subscribe and all that jazz. And if you're watching this on Patreon, then thank you so much for all your support. You guys get to see all the full videos and all the content and be part of the community, but I just appreciate all your support. It means that I can spend more time doing this than I would normally. So why not have a play with this? Why not do some simple drawings as I did at the beginning and play around with colour? You know, do not put yourself in a situation where you feel you've got to complete a drawing. It's not about that. It's about play. It's about just experimenting and getting a grip for using colour. So yeah, have a play, get your watercolours out, mess about, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.